I'm Flores. I'm a historian and a professor at Bowdoin College, and my book is titled Fields of Division: Latino Struggles for Rights in Agricultural California. My book basically tells the story of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants in the Salinas Valley between the years 1940 and 1970. There's been a lot of history about Latino civil rights organizing in big cities, so cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, El Paso. Stories have been told about how Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants there organized for their labor and civil rights throughout the 20th century. What a lot of history hasn't examined, though, are the lives of Latinos in smaller communities and more agriculture-centered communities like the ones we find in Monterey County. My research focuses on Salinas as a case study of how agricultural communities really give us a different lens onto how Latinos organized for their civil rights in a climate in which agribusiness was incredibly powerful in stifling union activity and also the political mobilization of Latinos in places like Salinas and in other towns around Monterey County. My book looks at the experiences of Mexican Americans born in the United States, Braceros, brought over as part of the Bracero program, which began in 1942 and lasted until 1964 in the United States, and also the experiences of undocumented Mexican immigrants who came into this country looking for work at mid-century. When so many agricultural positions were available, we had workers from Mexico coming into the US from all different types of backgrounds. They had grown up in urban Mexico City, wanting a new life. They had grown up in a very small farming town or village in Mexico and could no longer afford to support their families there. And so a lot of these Mexican immigrants wanted to become braceros. Bracero, when we take the word in its literal translation, means arm man. So literally a man who works with his arms. And braceros were basically imported guest workers who were brought from Mexico to the United States to work in fields and factories between the years 1942 and 1964. This was a program that lasted for over 20 years, but still in mainstream history texts is not a labor program we hear a lot about. So my book tells us more about how this program operated within the United States in general, but within Monterey County specifically. Next to the Imperial Valley in California, Monterey County was one of the hugest employers of braceros in the United States. It was basically because there was so much farmland, growers wanted to obtain a lot of profits, so braceros seemed like the easy solution. They were cheaper than US workers. They did not have to be unionized. In fact, they were prohibited from joining unions. Braceros were basically agribusiness's perfect solution to creating high profits with a temporary labor force. So the first shipment of 500 braceros came to Monterey County in 1942. And every year after that, the amount of braceros just doubled and tripled and quadrupled to the point where the bracero population was just as large as the population of towns like Salinas or like Greenfield or King City. Braceros were a huge part of the fabric of the agricultural industry, but yet they were often marginalized from the social fabric of the communities in which they lived. So braceros were often housed on the outskirts of town in their own labor camps, where they all lived together in bunks or in cots, in barrack-style housing, basically. And braceros were brought over without their families. The US government wanted available single men who could do hard labor in US agriculture. So part of the bracero contracting process began in Mexico, and it began with braceros being tested for how well they could perform hard labor in US fields. So braceros were often tested for the strength of their arms, for their physical health. They were given many examinations by US doctors and nurses. They had to be deloused several times upon entering the United States. There was this fear that even with this desirable influx of workers, there was still this fear that Mexican workers would bring things like disease into the country, also questionable morals. This was all proved wrong because braceros were very family-oriented. The reason that they were joining this program was to support their families in Mexico. They left their wives, children, parents at home in Mexico while they went on an adventure to the United States to try to obtain higher wages and better conditions for themselves and their families to pull them out of poverty in Mexico. The Bracero program was meant to be a temporary wartime initiative to meet the labor shortage of World War II while soldiers were away, but actually the program lasted for over 20 years in this country because braceros presented such an attractive labor force to U.S. agribusiness. Growers employed braceros by the thousands, not only in California, but in states across the Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the Midwest. Braceros became really integral figures in agricultural labor. As a result, this created tensions with Mexican Americans who felt that braceros were stealing their jobs away from them and also stealing other resources such as housing and public aid and the basic comforts of living in the United States and in California. So braceros and Mexican Americans were kind of put into this conflicted relationship. They were of the same ethnicity, they were of the same national background and heritage, yet they were put into competition with each other in the labor market, which then hindered the ability of these two groups to come together and politically mobilize. This political mobilization wouldn't happen until the late 1960s when Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union would come into the region and begin organizing lettuce workers in the Salinas Valley in 1970. The condition of a bracero coming into the United States for the first time to work was one of a lot of fear and uncertainty about what their position would be in the United States. Oftentimes, braceros were not given information about the location that they were going to go work in, how much they would make in terms of wages, who else they would be working alongside in the fields. Oftentimes, braceros who were cousins or relatives were separated at reception centers in Mexico and put on separate trains or separate buses to places in the United States. So family members who wanted to join the program together were separated oftentimes very severely, put into different places geographically across the US, and felt very disconnected from their families as a result of that. There was a lot of isolation when it came to being a bracero in the United States. In Monterey County, braceros were often housed on the outskirts of the towns in which they worked. So bracero camps were bunkhouses in which braceros were kept during the work week. They were often not given any means of transportation into town except on the weekends. So in Salinas, for example, braceros could only hitch a ride from their foreman or take a bus or have to walk 4 or 5 miles into Main Street in Salinas to visit bars, to visit Chinatown, to visit department stores, to buy things for themselves and their families. These were their weekends. It was trying to integrate themselves into ordinary social life. On the weekends, they would be doing this, but they could only go to the places that catered to a Mexican clientele. So braceros were not only kept out of ordinary social life for most of the work week, but they were then confined to spaces that would accept them based on their race and based on their nationality. So this created a lot of isolation in the minds of braceros, a lot of disillusionment about working in the United States. The United States went from being this country where opportunity and freedom seemed to be abundant, yet in the program, if one got into the daily life of a bracero, one found back-breaking work for up to 14 hours a day, working in lettuce fields or carrot fields or beet fields in Monterey County. It was a life marked by very little time to figure out one's place in the United States. It was a life of social marginalization. It was a life of racial discrimination, based on their Mexicanness, and it was a life that was based upon the idea that they were only temporary laborers in this country, and therefore they were never treated as people who could be put on a path to citizenship in the United States. Braceros were meant to come work in the US and leave after 6 to 9 months when their contract was over. Of course, this didn't always happen. Braceros often overstayed their contracts in the United States or tried to become braceros again for a different employer in the country. And this was because the program itself, though it offered much higher wages than one could make in Mexico, was still offering very substandard wages, which required a bracero to come into the United States multiple times just to make enough for their family to survive on. Bracero's legacy in Monterey County is one that we still see within the region today. This region has a huge ex-bracero population. Braceros who either became naturalized citizens in this country, who decided to stay past their contracts and create a life for themselves and their families in the United States, and braceros who have often been reunited with their children, who have grown up in the US as Latinos. Braceros in Monterey County are a huge part of why we have such an interesting diversity in this region's demographic. I think this diversity comes not only from racial status and nationality diversity, but also the diversity in experience of living in this county. Braceros were actually the figures who made this region the productive agricultural place that it ended up becoming by the mid-20th century because of all the labor, because of all the numbers of braceros who came into California during the 1940s, the 1950s, and the early 1960s. These people are still around. They still have issues to fight for in terms of working conditions and better lives for farm workers in this state and in other states in this country. And I think their legacy is one to be remembered because this was a huge guest worker program in the nation that in history books we don't often get to talk about. This program was huge, not only for the amount of growth that agribusiness was able to enjoy because of braceros, but also because braceros brought a degree of diversity to this country and a diversity to the Latino demographic that we're still seeing today, working in terms of political mobilization of Latinos in this country. We cannot forget the immigrants who came here and are still coming here to contribute to the economic progress of this nation and also the very sectors of industry that have profited from their labor for decades throughout the 20th century.